So, a live look at the White House on this Saturday afternoon. It is approaching 3 p.m. in the nation's capital. We have standing by with us here the AP's Will Weissert. He tracks the White House for the Associated Press. As always, so much to discuss on these Saturdays, Will. Let's start with tariffs. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that President Trump lacked authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose sweeping global tariffs. We've heard about Trump's newly announced 15% global tariff. From what you're hearing, is the administration fairly confident that they will work around yesterday's ruling?
I think they are. Basically, we had this executive order yesterday imposing temporarily for 150 days the 10% tariff. Now he's just announced online here that he wants to go up 15%. The feeling with the White House is basically he can do whatever he wants in terms of setting policy for 150 days without congressional approval. And I think, he's very clearly sending the message that despite the court sort of providing a very large and important check on presidential powers, he doesn't sort of see that as a setback, and he wants to keep imposing these policies and really do it in the same sort of way that he did before. There's other than the 150-day deadline, there really isn't a lot of difference from the decision the court already made in terms of striking down some tariffs, sweeping tariffs, using essentially executive order and not waiting for Congress. The administration and the president aren't planning to wait for Congress. They're running to just sort of push ahead and maybe force another court challenge.
Let's read President Trump's statement earlier. He says, based on a thorough, detailed, and complete review of the ridiculous, poorly written, and extraordinarily anti-American decision on tariffs issued yesterday, after many months of contemplation by the United States Supreme Court, please let this statement serve to represent that I, as President of the United States of America, will be, effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. During the next short number of months, the Trump administration will determine and issue the new and legally permissible tariffs, which will continue our extraordinarily successful process of making America great again. So, Will, Justices Barrett and Gorsuch, they were appointed by Trump. They've kind of become something that people have been fixating on in light of this. In fact, the president himself sent out another statement relating to them. He says this: what happened today with the two United States Supreme Court justices that I appointed against great opposition, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, whether people like it or not, never seems to happen with Democrats. They vote against the Republicans and never against themselves. Almost every single time, no matter how good a case we have. At least I didn't appoint Roberts, who led the effort to allow foreign countries that have been ripping us off for years to continue to do so. But we won't let it happen. The new tariffs, totally tested and accepted as law, are on their way. So let's talk about Barrett and Gorsuch, Will. They, as he mentions, were appointed by Trump. They struck down his tariffs yesterday. Before yesterday, Will, what was the White House's level of confidence that Trump-appointed justices would be more agreeable with Trump policies? And does it seem that that level of confidence has changed?
I think before yesterday, they were very confident that they were going to get a positive outcome here. Some of the legal cases against them, I think they acknowledged were strong, and there was a possibility that they might not prevail. But given that the court was 6-3 and there were so many Trump appointees, I think they felt pretty confident that they would eventually get a positive ruling, or at least a positive ruling in part, something that maybe set aside some of this, but maybe not quite as sweeping as what we saw. These are lifetime appointments, right? And Trump yesterday during the news conference, where his message was sort of muddled about how he was going to respond and move forward. One of the things he said was, Democrats want to pack the court and make it more than 9 justices. That's not something that's been being seriously considered by the administration. So they're kind of stuck with justices that he's appointed that don't always sort of do what he wanted. But what I find so fascinating here is he keeps saying that these are like legally accepted moves that he's going to make, and that's not technically true, right? What he's talking about is a dissent that Justice Kavanaugh, another one of his appointees, wrote with the 3 justices who voted in favor of the tariffs, who were ultimately outvoted 6-3. That's essentially said, legally speaking, Trump might be able to do at least most of what he wants to do with tariffs. that's a dissenting opinion. That is not something that is law. And that's something that's overruled by the majority, who wrote that he basically can't do this. So again, we're sort of seeing the president, despite losing in court, essentially saying that he didn't lose in court. And there is this sort of legal gray area where the law is concerned for 150 days. Another thing he said yesterday was that there are some other acts that he could lean on, going back to the 1930s Tariff Act and other things that he can try and invoke. But all of this stuff will again, draw legal challenges. And now that we've had this decision, it's pretty easy to imagine a situation where you have courts that move pretty quickly and say, "Look, this is settled law. Send it up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court doesn't say we already heard this," and dispatch it much faster. That's the other piece of this. The president said repeatedly over the last couple of weeks, especially the last couple of days, he was sort of tired of waiting, right? And he brought that up in the post that you just read. So at least now he knows the decision and he can sort of move forward, as he already is, to two orders in as many days. But again, the legality of this, it doesn't seem to be clear at all. And in fact, I don't know that there's a clear legal path for him to do some of the stuff he's trying to do.
The president also sending this out, saying, "My new hero is United States Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh and, of course, Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that they want to make America great again." Live look at the White House. The time in the nation's capital just past 3 p.m. We have to talk about Iran as well, Will. U.S. military forces are continuing to build up in the Middle East amid heightened tensions with the country, even as diplomatic negotiations continue. From what you're hearing from sources, is a strictly diplomatic solution still on the table with the Iranians, or does it feel like the White House is poised for some type of military action?
Well, I think diplomacy is still on the table. The president has said a lot of things on this, and sort of different aspects and different sort of conflicting answers, frankly, on where he wants to go and what the next move might be. But there are discussions that are still going on, and he has been very clear in saying that he would like to make some sort of a deal with Iran to where nuclear enrichment is concerned, that would allow them to potentially enrich uranium, but not for weapons purposes, not for attack purposes, for other pursuits and other reasons. That is certainly something that could continue to the position the White House could continue to have, and these are talks that continue to go on. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that there will be some sort of a diplomatic agreement. But as we just saw in your piece there, the buildup is real. Both sides are sort of digging in and preparing for a potential war. The president said yesterday in his comments to reporters that he would consider some sort of even limited strike, right? We may not have to go to a full-scale war, but there could be another, airstrike, sort of what we saw last summer when he talked about having obliterated the nuclear capabilities of Iran. The way the White House sees this is Trump is not going to take any of the sort of cards off the table, and the military buildup is a way to make sure that he negotiates from a position of strength as these talks continue. The problem, of course, is that Iran also has a say in this. They're digging in, that they see this as an act of aggression. They've been very clear that they feel like the military buildup is a direct threat, and that might make them less likely to look for a deal as well. So. Does this allow the president to negotiate from a position of strength? He'd say it does. Tehran says something completely different. That doesn't necessarily bode well for a diplomatic solution, but it also doesn't mean that the one's impossible to reach yet, and that we could still avoid war. All of this comes against the backdrop of the State of the Union as well. It's going to happen on Tuesday, regardless of what happens with tariffs or Iran or anything else. But I do think it guarantees that we're going to hear a lot about foreign policy. The president is saying He's going to talk about the economy. He's going to talk about domestic issues. He's going to try to set the tone for the midterms and drum up support for Republicans. But I do think we'll hear a lot of foreign policy, and I think we'll hear a lot about Iran.
Multiple news outlets this week were saying that an initial strike, you mentioned the idea of an initial strike. An initial strike, by the way, would be a lesser strike. This would not be a full-on campaign. That's what many sources are saying. I'm curious, though, because earlier this week, many outlets were saying an initial strike could come within days. It could come as soon as this weekend. Here we are, Saturday. Have you heard anything to suggest that there is something imminent?
Well, I think this is simply a case where there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions, and often very informed opinions, right? And they're talking to reporters and talking to me. They're saying what they're hearing. There's really only one person that's going to decide this, right? And it's the president. And from what I hear, he's not fully made up his mind yet. Like I said, I think they don't want to limit. They don't want to sort of take options off the table for him. But we didn't really have any advanced warning that the strike against Maduro in Venezuela was going to happen. So I certainly wouldn't rule it out. My reporting has not taken me to it's imminent, but I've read the same reports that you have. Some of this could also be trial balloons, right? There's certainly a more hawkish part of the administration. There's certain folks that like to sort of leak this stuff out to sort of see what the reaction would be, even among the boss, right? Even sort of with Trump and what he might sort of think about this. So I don't. I don't have reporting saying that this is going to happen one way or the other, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out. And I also don't think that just because we heard it might be days away and here we are Saturday doesn't mean it won't happen for sure either.
Yeah, that's interesting. The game of negotiating in public that we see sometimes with these things. Let's talk about Russia and Ukraine while we're talking about international issues. There are continuing peace negotiations involving the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia, including recent trilateral talks in Geneva. Zelensky has publicly said, Will, that there are still opportunities for a dignified end to this war. How involved is Trump in the most recent Russia-Ukraine negotiations?
It's a good question. I think in this case, he always has a lot on his plate, but we're preparing for the speech. A lot of his domestic team is worried about rewriting the State of the Union, frankly, after what happened with the decision on Friday. He also has Iran to worry about and several other things. I do think he's engaged. I also think that he is, specifically when it comes to Ukraine and this latest rounds of talks, he's tried to empower the negotiators a little bit more, right, to get some of the work done without him necessarily having to be involved personally. But I do think, especially from the European side, there's a lot of frustration that there hasn't been more pressure on Russia, specifically on Putin, right, to make some more concessions and sort of get this done. And if President Trump's been consistent about one thing, it's been months and months and months of saying he's frustrated, right, and he'd like to see more of these move faster. So far, I don't want to call it a nothing burger, right, but it certainly hasn't led to any sort of major breakthroughs. I don't think we're sort of expecting any major breakthroughs today either. But I do think that obviously in the sort of long list of things that the president is working on today and going forward, Ukraine is probably not the first thing he's thinking.
State of the Union is, as you say, Tuesday night. It's going to be 9 p.m. Eastern time. We will carry it on our air uninterrupted. You've already gone over some of this. I'm hoping we can expand, Will. What are likely Trump's major points of focus for the big speech?
So he says that he's going to focus on how the country, America, is the hottest country in the world, right? The economy is booming. We're going to hear a lot about the recent record high that the Dow Jones Industrial Average, hit and then fell back under, but is sort of hovered near. The S&P setting records recently. I'm sure he'll talk about the jobs report, right, and showing that job creation was stronger last month than was expected and forecast. The message will be sort of domestically focused and that everything's going well and that things are booming. The real issue is not everybody feels that. I feel like every time I come on, we sort of talk about this, but there are voters that say, look, things are too expensive. I don't see a booming economy. And they're maybe not going to be so ready to have Trump, brag about everything and be willing to support Republicans in the midterms. Another couple things interesting to watch. These speeches tend to be lists, right? He gets up and talks about all sorts of things. What issues he focuses on, right? It might be a hint of like who in his cabinet is particularly having their star on the rise right now, right? If he talks a lot about agriculture, Brooke Rollins might have his ear, or Maha, that might be an indication that Secretary Kennedy, is particularly sort of in the limelight right now. And then what he doesn't say, right? If he doesn't talk about certain issues, maybe that suggests that there are particular advisors that maybe aren't, quite as sort of in favored status right now. But as with anything, President Trump, there will be a written speech. There will be a lot of ground to cover. But he will obviously, he always does. He relishes sort of going off speech and doing the weave, as he calls it, right, and talk about all sorts of things he likes to talk about. So, we might hear about the 2020 election and his sort of false claims, right, that he won it. And we might hear things about him not winning the Nobel Peace Prize. We might hear talk about affordability and how prices are coming down, but also making fun of the Democrats and saying it's not a real issue, that the Democrats are just, ginning all this stuff up. So I do think it'll be sort of fascinating, this push and pull between like the formal policy part of this and also just Trump basically going off script, right, and sort of saying what he wants to say. And the final sort of fascinating piece of this is his main job will be to get voters excited going into the midterms, right? I mean, this is a speech that's going to draw millions of people. People say, "Oh, nobody watches the State of the Union." That's not true. It's very much like a traditional, almost like a Super Bowl in the fact that this is still an event that people gather on their TVs and watch. We don't really have that in today's sort of bifurcated media environment. This is a case where people watch this, they watch it live. It'll be a huge audience. Can Trump really make the case that Republicans, who already control the White House and both houses of Congress, should keep it? And that's really how convincing a case he can make on the economy is going to be the biggest piece of that.
For some reason, the speech that Trump gave to Congress last year, the first speech during a president's term is not officially called a State of the Union. He did give one of these speeches last year. We're looking at video of it right now. He gave that to a joint session of Congress. That's why, if anybody's curious, that's why people are calling this one his first State of the Union of this term, because technically the one last year wasn't one. Let's talk about the midterms, Will. It's interesting because the president, he's been making campaign stops. He was recently in North Carolina. He was recently in Georgia, of course, important battleground states. Let's talk about the importance of the midterms. What's at stake for both parties come November? What's Trump going to be focusing on, and what are the Democrats going to be focusing on potentially in their rebuttal after the speech?
Well, I hate to sort of sound like a broken record, but I think the answer to both counts is the economy, right? I do think we'll hear a lot about foreign policy because that's a real win. Or Trump sees it as areas where he's won, and he'll talk about that. But I think most of the viewers at home will be really watching more for information about the economy, right? And whether the job creation will remain strong, whether they can see larger tax returns than the year before, whether the consumer confidence, that people are feeling good enough to go out and buy and make big purchases. And, poll after poll from AP and poll from a lot of others shows that, a lot of the sort of positive economic message hasn't really gotten out there yet. As far as the midterms are concerned, we saw this in Trump's first administration, right? The Republicans had sort of uniform control in Washington when we took over. They had the Congress and they also had the White House. And then we had the blue wave in 2018. And the White House has acknowledged that really limited what Trump was able to do the last 2 years of his first term, right? He had a check on the presidency they didn't have going around the first 2 years. That made it a lot more difficult to move forward policy-wise. It ended up with him being impeached twice by the end, right? And he's talked about that now. He says, if we don't win the midterms, if the Republicans don't win the midterms, the Democrats are going to impeach me. Now, from a Democratic standpoint, it's really easy when you're opposition party to say, look, the economy's not improving. People are still hurting. We need more work done. It's a lot harder to actually do it, right? So in terms of the speech itself, a lot of Democrats are boycotting, right? The lawmakers are saying they're not going to go. They're going to go to a protest, a sort of People's State of the Union. It's going to happen on the Mall. That will prevent any sort of outburst or anything, people heckling potentially like we've had in the past against Democratic presidents, against President Biden and President Obama. But the Democrats will very much, the message in the response is going to be, kitchen table issues matter. And this president who was elected saying essentially, I'm going to crack down on the border, but I'm also going to, help your pocketbook and help your bottom line. Democrats say, look, he hasn't brought down prices, that things are still too expensive. And also they're going to raise questions about his immigration policy, given what happened in Minnesota, the slaying of 2 American citizens. Another thing the poll is showing is that even bipartisan, like even some Republicans are starting to feel like the Trump immigration policies are going too far. So those are both ready-made issues for Democrats. Whether or not they'll have a tough task too. They'll have to convince voters going into November they deserve control of Congress so they can make improvements both in immigration and the economy. Also easier said than done.
Last week, if you had asked me if I would be talking to you today about extraterrestrials a couple of days before the State of the Union, I would have thought you'd be off your rocker. But Here we are. Extraterrestrials are in the news. President Trump says he's directing the government to release classified files about UFOs and extraterrestrial life in response to a spike in interest in the subject. It was caused by an interview with former President Obama earlier this week. Obama suggested that aliens are real, though he hadn't seen any proof while he was president. Will, are we going to get something otherworldly out of these files? What does your gut tell you?
I want to make it very clear. I have no sources in outer space. Okay, I wish I did. That would be really interesting. Look, my personal gut feeling is this is going to be a nothing burger, right? We've been down this road before with the JFK release and other things that people were very, very excited about. There was a lot of information in there. There wasn't really a lot of sort of earth-shattering things that came out of it. I would imagine that anything released in terms of UFOs will be more of the same. But I love this whole line of questioning. Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was asked about the president's daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, right, suggesting that there was a secret speech that was already written and that Trump was prepared to give at the appropriate time. Now, Lord knows exactly when the appropriate time would be. Perhaps if an alien came and knocked on the White House door or something. But, she was sort of made a very, very sort of funny moment about it and said, well, that's news to me. I can check with our speech writing team, but I don't think he has an address sort of ready to go. I think he capitalized on a moment after that, and he ordered this release. Is it going to be earth shattering or maybe space shattering, as it were? I don't believe so, but I should also not predict because I'm often wrong.
Will, you're going to be busy on Tuesday night. How can people track your coverage on State of the Union night?
Well, of course, AP will have several stories up that we'll be furiously updating throughout the night. We'll get maybe 50 versions of that, and we'll also have a live blog and separate stories on foreign policy and the economy. APnews.com is the place to look for it, or really websites all over the country and the world too.
Will, we appreciate you. Good to check in with you. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.